Hello bread lovers! If you're thinking into diving into the world of sourdough bread, or if you've already started but your bread is turning more like loaves of brick, then this is the right space for you. My name is Silvana. In today's video I want to go through all the mistakes that I made as a beginner during my sourdough baking journey, how to fix them, the tools that you have around the kitchen that you can use for this instead of like going and spending your hard-earned cash. We're going to talk about bulk fermentation, and we're going to make this amazing blueberry lemon focaccia bread. So if that's something that you want to see, stick around and spend about half an hour with me so I can tell you all about how to turn those dense, gummy brick loaves of bread into perfect sourdough bread. First thing you will need to start making own sourdough bread is a starter. It takes about 7 days, and I made a series of shorts videos day by day making my own starter from scratch with no scale and no discard, because I think that's the easiest way for any beginner who doesn't have a kitchen scale or doesn't want to invest in one, because you know it's gonna lie around just like how all the gadgets in the kitchen sometimes lie around. But it's the easiest way to do it. It's day by day that I made the series, and I kind of compiled it in another 50-second videos, but I highly recommend that you go through that just because it's the easiest, and all you need is unbleached all-purpose flour. And I would highly recommend you get some distilled water, just because none of us know, or at least I don't know, the amount of chlorine that is in my water. And based on my research and what I've read online, is chlorine tends to kill the natural yeast bacteria that's being created as you're making your starter. So grab yourself a jug of distilled water, some unbleached all-purpose flour, and that's all you need to make your own starter. And that's one of the ways, and personally the most rewarding way about going on and making your own starter. Secondly, you can buy actually dehydrated. Oh, sorry, my baby is playing around. You can buy dehydrated starter. And this is my new project that I am trying, because I'm going to be spending a month in Europe to see my parents, and I really want to make sourdough bread there. I started dehydrating my own flour starter to see how it works out, because I can't bring like a jar with me, or at least I'm not willing to do that. But if I can figure out how to dehydrate it and rehydrate it back into a strong starter, that's what I'm planning to do. But you can buy these. You can buy these online, and that's somebody else who's created the starter. They sell it. That's another way that you can go. And the third way, I guess, like if you have someone in the family or your friends or somebody in the neighborhood who makes sourdough bread, you can ask to borrow some of their starter, and it's like no cost to them, because it's just flour and water at the end of the day. Those are the 3 ways that you can make your starter. If you follow my 7 days day by day and you're stuck in any day, send me a comment in that video and I'll be able to help you out, just because you know I'm a super small channel, so I have all the time in the world to like answer all your questions. So feel free to drop a comment there. But that's how you can make it, and I highly recommend you follow those videos, because one thing that's really different is that I talk about consistency. I don't talk about feeding ratios. And I think that's the second point. If you already have a starter and you're following the 1-to-1 ratio or whatever feeding ratios, you are likely going to end up with a very runny starter acidity that is not giving your bread the best chance at becoming that fluffy, well-risen bread. So looking for a consistency in your starter, and later on even in your dough, is one of the biggest things that you can change if you are getting not so good loaves of bread, or brick dense gummy loaves of bread. So we're gonna feed this starter, and then I'll show you consistency, and I'm gonna feed it, and that's how I do it all the time. No scale, no discard, because I already baked with it, so there's not that much left. It's kind of at the bottom of the jar, if you see, like it's kind of here. So we're gonna feed it, and I'll show you consistency. This is the consistency that it has right now. It's okay, but it's still a little runny, so we're going to make it a little thicker. So let's get some flour going. So I have a 1/4 cup here, and usually I just feed it with this, to be honest. We'll talk about the tools that you don't need, but because I just use a jar, a regular jar that I have left. But if your jar has a little bit of a wider opening, I would recommend it. And I'm just going to eyeball. Oh, 1 second. I think the baby made it into the bathroom, so let me check that first. Okay, we're back. So I will just add water like this. I start a little bit, and what I'm looking for obviously is that all the flour and the water are nicely incorporated. And the next thing is, you'd rather go for the thicker consistency than leave it thin, because as the yeast is feeding, if you leave it thin, they're not going to have enough to feed on, and your starter is going to be runny and very acidic. So that 1/4 cup of flour with a little bit, this is the consistency that I have now. And this is what I'm looking for. I'm looking for a thick pancake batter consistency. Right now I have this at about 8 ounces. This jar, I like it because it has like its own kind of measuring. I have it about 8 ounces there. And for the loaf of bread that we're gonna need, because I have another starter, this is enough. So we're going to cover this. You can loosely cover it with its own, sorry, I'm a little lost here. Here it is. I usually do a little plastic thing with an elastic band around it, and I just poked holes with a fork. You'll see that as I'm making my starter in those videos. That's what I do. But you can easily just use the lid and leave it like this. The reason I don't do this is because sometimes it overflows and it's just so hard to clean the lid in all the nooks and crannies. So I just do it this way and it works perfectly. But we fed the starter. You saw what consistency we're looking for. I did not use a scale, and that's the number one thing that I've learned now from when I started, is that look for the consistency and don't go by ratios. Just know how much roughly you need. You need about 100 grams, and that 100 grams is usually about a 1/2 cup. That's what I need for a traditional 1 loaf of bread. And I look for the consistency and I feed it as much to not have it runny. So we're gonna let this rise, and we're gonna go into the second part of how to kind of troubleshoot what you're going through if you're not making those perfect loaves of bread, because the starter is the number one, but there's more in the starter that you need to kind of pay attention to in order to see if you are going to be making a good loaf of bread down the line or not. So right now it's about 10:26, 10:30 in the morning that we fed the starter. Now, when I was starting out, my starter would double within 24 hours. Sometimes it would even triple within 24 hours. And I'm like, oh my God, I have an overflowing starter. It's so active. It's amazing. Let's bake a loaf of bread. And then my bread would flop. The starter, to be considered a strong, mature starter, needs to double quicker. 24 hours is way too long for the starter to double. So if your starter is taking that long, then you need to strengthen. Your starter is sluggish and you need to strengthen it. How do we strengthen the starter? The easiest way that I found strengthening the starter is by giving it a feed of whole wheat all-purpose flour. If you have rye flour in the pantry, that's also known to have more nutrients, so that's another way to to strengthen your sluggish starter. I haven't tried it because, again, I haven't bought anything outside of my staple kitchen stuff that I have. I never use the rye flour, so I didn't go out to buy it specifically for this. But feeding it a big feed of whole-purpose flour. And then the third way is feeding it twice a day. Feed it twice a day every 12 hours and it will start strengthening. So those are the ways to strengthen your sluggish starter. But keep an eye, how long does it take for your starter to double? So we are at 1027. We are at 8 ounces. So let's just mark this for the sake of this experiment. I wonder if this highlighter will work. So right there at 1027, 1030, and we will come back when this has doubled and we are going to bake something so delicious. And as I'm doing it, I'll show you the steps and we'll talk about all the mistakes along the way that we could be making that are giving us those dense brick-like loaves instead of giving us those beautiful sourdough loaves that you see all over internet. So while the starter is rising, let's talk about the tools or the gadgets that you need to bake sourdough bread, or better yet, you don't need, because I bet almost everything that you need, it's actually stuff that you have around in the kitchen. That was one of the main things when I started out. I wasn't sure if I was going to commit to this. It was going to be something that I'm just overly excited at the beginning and I see how hard it is. And then I just I'm like, no, this is not for me. Too messy, too much time. So I didn't want to go and invest in Benetton basket and dough whisker and all of that. So I just looked around the kitchen and saw what I had and I used what I had. And my plan was that I'm not going to buy anything specific until I make a good loaf of bread. And then once I baked a good loaf of bread, I was like, well, if I can do it without all this stuff, then why would I bother spending the money on all this? So let's walk through. I kind of laid most of the stuff and I'm going to group them from like starter to preparing the dough to bulk proofing and baking, things that you need, things that maybe down the line I kind of like invested. But let's go to the counter and see what you can come up. I love it. He likes to chat, especially when I'm chatting. So let me take you to the counter and go over everything. So first thing first is the starter. As you saw, the main thing that you need for the starter is a jar. I would suggest a glass jar. You really don't need to go buy any specific jar. This is a tomato sauce jar, nicely cleaned, so it's no residue left in it. And that's what I use to mix my dough. This one particularly is helpful because for some reason on the side it has like measurements as well. But to measure the rise, you can use a marker or these elastic bands. People usually will put the elastic band where up to where the starter is fed and then see how much it's risen, because you want like double or triple rise on your starter. And then to mix, you can use like a little spatula like this. This is plastic, so as you saw, I like the consistency of the starter a little thicker. Sometimes I actually broken one of these. So now I just stick to a fork, and I love the fork more than the spoon because it makes sure that all the dough, all the flour and the water are nicely incorporated. Are you gonna let mommy talk or do you want to do the video? Yeah? So that's all you need for the starter. Like a fork, a jar, can use its own lid or a saran wrap with a little elastic band. And then here's where I just would poke the hole because you do want some air to come from the environment so the bacteria can come from the environment as well. That's the starter. Now from the starter we go to mixing bowls. I used to use this one, and it's like a heavy porcelain bowl. The problem with this, and you can still use it, and now that I'm more seasoned, I use this. The problem with this is that sometimes you can't tell Sorry, I had to stop and attend to the baby, but we were talking about this large porcelain bowl, which now I use. But the problem with it, as you are starting out, is that you can't really tell, it doesn't have any measurements, and you can't really tell if your dough has doubled in size or not. And the biggest problem that I see people make, and I made myself, is that you're second guessing. It's like, is it doubled? And you see some rise and you're like, oh, this should be good. This looks good. So you're cutting bulk fermentation too early. And if there's anything that I recommend, rather going longer and ensuring that your dough has doubled or tripled in size, rather than cutting bulk fermentation shorter, because that's one of the main sources of the problems with people starting out to make sourdough. And that was definitely one of my main problems. So instead of using something that you can see if the dough has doubled in size, and it's closed like this with no measurement, I would recommend one of these clear bowls, because in this one you can clearly see when your dough has doubled in size and there's no second guessing. I have a bigger one for when I go for more than one loaf, and I have this like cheap Dollarama one. This one is also good because I believe it has, so it has measurements on the side as well, so you also know when clearly your dough has doubled in size. But these are plastic. A glass one as well would work fine, but I would stay away as you're starting out from these closed, non-clear bowls. And then for the lids, I never use anything to, like any specific towel or anything like that. I just use the lids that they come with, and I don't fully close it. I will just snap each side closed like this, and then it's still open enough that air will flow through. I have like there, and then in this one I will just put it loosely on top while the dough is rising. So that's what I use to mix the dough, and I will use just the same fork to mix it, and when we prepare the dough you'll see how that works out. Now, I mentioned that you don't really need a scale, especially to make the starter, and if you use my method that I mentioned at the beginning. But when it comes to mixing the dough, a scale is helpful, especially at the beginning, or you can look to see how to convert the grams into cups. If you do have a scale, that's great. If not, investing in a cheaper one, or just something to gauge how much flour and water you're using will be helpful. As we make the dough, I will show you in cups everything that I'm measuring, so it's helpful for you to make your first loaf of bread. But so these are the mixing bowls that I use at the moment, and I haven't purchased anything specific. So we went through what we need for the starter. This is what we need for the mixing. And now after we mix and we have the dough that has risen, we are going to pre-shape, and we'll go through all of those visually. But in terms of tools, and you see proofing baskets and banneton baskets and things like that, I have not purchased one yet. This is the inside of the salad spinner. I will line it up with a tea towel that is well floured, and then the bread will go in there, cover it up, and put it in the fridge. That's what I use for proofing basket. You can also use a regular bowl like this. I just like to use this to kind of imitate the proofing baskets that are aired out a little bit. If you want a loaf these are my loaf pans that I cook in, I do the same thing. I will line the towel like this, and I will put the dough to proof in the fridge in these loaf pans. For the shape of a longer loaf, and for a bowl, I just use this. So no proofing baskets, no bannetons needed. This is all you need as a beginner. And now that I'm even more seasoned, I'm still just using this and a well-floured tea towel. the next part is baking. Let's go through the tools that we need to bake and score. I'll clean the counter because I don't have enough counter space, and we'll come back to that. When it comes to baking sourdough bread, a Dutch oven is what's most commonly used in all the videos that you see. I did not have a Dutch oven until the last, I actually got it as a Christmas gift once my husband saw that after 4 months I was really committed to sourdough. So he got me a Dutch oven for as a Christmas gift, but that's what's most commonly used. I used to think that the reason why my bread wasn't coming as good was because I didn't have a Dutch oven. And now there's many times that I don't even use a Dutch oven and my bread is phenomenal. So if you don't have a Dutch oven, don't worry. You can still make amazing sourdough bread without it. It's easier, I think, like if you have it handy, but it's just not necessary. Similar to the Dutch oven, a cast iron with a lid will do the work as well. What I've been using a lot are just regular bread tins, loaves like this. And the way I will do this is by putting the bread in, covering with the other one, and just baking it like this. So essentially anything that you can just kind of have like with a lid and handles high temperatures will work just fine. So yeah, that's what you need to bake. And if you've seen those like fancy things, slings that they drop the bread in, I think they're made with silicone. I don't have any of that. What I use, I'll show you 1 second what I use. I just use like parchment paper, and I save my parchment paper, so I get a lot of use out of my parchment paper. And the biggest thing is that for these loaf pans, I cut it in a way that I can just drop. Let me just show you how to cut it. The way I do it is that I just put the pan on top of parchment paper, and then I trace with a pencil everywhere. On all 4 sides. And you're going to cut these corners out. You'll see I'll usually put the bread in here and then just grab it. And it's going to drop inside like that. But yeah, no fancy sling, and I'll just save this until it's completely burned out. And for the Dutch oven, there's nothing fancy to cut. You just like put it in this and drop it inside the Dutch oven. It works totally fine. And now the last part of the sourdough baking journey is scoring it. And this is the only kind of professional tool, if you say, I bought this just like super recently, just because I want to kind of venture off in making some more beautiful designs on my dough. But before that, all you need is a pair of super sharp scissors or just a super sharp knife to make that long cut. And as we're making the bread, I'll walk you through that. But you don't really need like a bread lom for that. You can just use a sharp kitchen knife, sharp scissors, and those will do the trick just fine. So it's 317. The starter has already doubled. It's all the way up to here. It is ready to bake, but my 4-year-old just came from school, so it's snack time. So I'm just gonna like cover this and leave it until I'm ready to start mixing the dough. But it's already doubled, so basically from 10:30, and it's, let's say, almost 3:30, so it took 5 hours for it to double in size, and that's what I'm looking for. The temperature here is 22 degrees. It took 5 hours for my starter to double. If yours is taking longer, then go back and look at the ways that we talked about how to strengthen your starter. Okay, let's mix it up. So 1.5 cups of water, and I'm using my distilled water, should be about 325 grams, what most recipes require. So that's what I'm going to add here. And then the next thing that I always do is I add the starter. Go for 1/2 cup. If you don't have a measuring scale, go for 1/2 cup, and it doesn't hurt having more starter. And we're just going to mix this nicely. Sometimes the recipe can be the people measuring different ways, the scales or everything like that. So as a beginner, I would look for a consistency that is like this. It's a little bit harder to incorporate with like your fork or whatever you're using. And at this point, I go in with my clean hand and I make sure that everything is nicely incorporated here. I'm in the last set of stretch and fold, and I didn't film everything just because the purpose of this is not to just show you how to make bread. It's more of like everything that I've learned along the way, and the mistakes that I was making. And bulk fermentation was where I was making one of the biggest mistakes aside from the sourdough starter. So bulk fermentation starts after that first hour that you let your dough rest. So I used to look at all the recipes and it would say like, let it bulk ferment for 6 to 8 hours, or depending on the temperature where you're at. And there's also a chart that shows you like what temperature your house would be in and how long you would let your dough ferment. And I would follow that, especially in the winter, because I'm like, okay, my house is too cold or things like that. And I would always second guess and keep watching the dough and getting patient and cut bulk fermentation too short. So if you are starting out, I wouldn't bother looking at all those charts and everything that you see. What I would look is clear signs that the dough has doubled in size. So even though we've been like about 3.5 hours, 3 hours between the time that I let it rest, almost 2 hours, and the stretch and folds and the coil folds, we can clearly see that this dough hasn't doubled in size. So if I were a beginner, I'd be like, well, that was 3.5 hours since I've started. Maybe I'll give it another 3 hours, and that's 6 hours, and then it should be okay. But it's not. So this is where we're at right now. I'm going to cover it. I just snap the 2 sides as I mentioned, and I leave the other 2 open because you don't want to close anything too tight. And I'm going to leave this in the counter, and I'm going to come back and clearly show you when it has doubled in size. So we have a long way to go for this to double in size. I don't want you to second guess it because that was one of the biggest mistakes I made. I want you to clearly see that your dough is double. Good morning. So it's the next morning. I did not time properly when I was making the dough, so I didn't want to show you at nighttime. I actually had to put my alarm around, I think 2:30 in the morning to kind of cut the bulk fermentation, just because I wasn't going to do a pre-shape at that time and I didn't want it to go for it to over ferment, so I put it in the fridge. So this is not going to be like a traditional make a sourdough loaf with me. As I mentioned, it's more of like my journey and things that I've used along the way, things that you can do as a beginner, and mistakes that I was making. And as I mentioned, as I was making the dough, bulk fermentation was one of the main, aside from the starter. Starter had 2 areas where I was making the most mistakes, and then bulk fermentation was the biggest one. And it's because I was cutting it too short. I was second guessing, has it doubled, has it not doubled? So I have mine in the fridge now. And we're not going to turn this into a bread. As I mentioned, we're going to do something more fun that I'm trying for the first time and show you guys. But this is the dough. This has clearly doubled in size, right? Like you see lots of bubbles. It's jiggly. This is probably more than doubled in size. See that jiggle? You want to see that jiggle. It's domed on top, and you need to see a lot and a lot of bubbles on the bowl. You see that? If you don't see that on your dough, then let it ferment longer, because if you cut it short, you're going to get that dense brick-like bread that you don't want and you're trying to avoid. So yeah, that's what I wanted to show you guys. Wait for double. And this is where these clear, double or triple, this is where these clear containers that you mix the dough are going to come in handy. Because if I had that red bowl that I showed you before, yes, I could probably tell if it's increased in volume, but like if I'm staying there and watching it, then you know that's not going to serve me any purpose, and I might cut bulk fermentation too short. So to kind of recap everything, starter, the main thing with the starter is number one, the consistency of your starter. What ratios are you feeding? 2, is your starter doubling? As you saw, my starter doubled easily in 5.5 hours in a temperature of like 21, 22 degrees in the house. And it's winter here in Canada, so and my starter still doubled. So if it's taking 12, 24 hours to double, then you need to kind of reinforce that starter with the methods that I mentioned at the beginning. So that's the starter part, and the second part is the bulk fermentation. Make sure you are seeing that clear doubling in size. So the rest of the steps between cold fermenting or letting it ferment on the counter or arise in the counter for the second time for 4 to 6 hours, or like, you know, the pre-shaping, yes, those have impacts in terms of like, are you going to get that ear or like that oven spring? But I don't think they compromise a good loaf of bread as much as the starter and the bulk fermentation do. So there you have it. Now I am going to show you a little treat that I'm going to make with this because spring is in the air, and I'm attempting to do a lemon, blueberry, and like a Danish cheese focaccia bread. So if you want to stick around for that, I will kind of mute myself and you can see how that turns out. I hope you found this video helpful. If you have any questions for anything that I've explained throughout this probably 30-minute video or so, please let me know in the comments. Also, make sure you show the video some love. I love sharing what I do in the kitchen, and I would love to know if it's helping anybody out there. Otherwise, there's no purpose. But yeah, let me know, show me some love, and give it a big thumbs up. If you obviously find any value on what I bring forward in my shorts videos, subscribe would also help to my channel. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.